Happy May.
There we go. Okay. I was a little concerned because nobody was telling me at this end that I was being recorded, and that seemed odd for a platform that is supposed to respect user privacy, but it just took a bit.
Yeah, that's cool. All right. So I'm a science fiction author with a biology background, and I thought you sound like an interesting person. We have some things in common, so that's one reason I wanted to interview you. So thank you for taking the time. And I have read a bit of your blog and dug around a little bit on the wonderful internets, and have seen some rather juicy and interesting factoids, some of which I will not get into here, but I should have, in retrospect, maybe come up with a Mad Libs thing that I could do maybe another time. So fill in the blank, or one of those "can I buy a vowel" situations. So
I'm actually pretty copacetic. I mean, if it is all, as you say, out in the air quotes wonderful internet, then it's not really much of a secret in any of it. Am I right? So,
true, but it's an adventure. I like adventures, and I like stories, and so here we are.
Okay.
All right. So I'm just this is sort of a bit of a freewheeling interview. I didn't have really hard structure. I have some basic questions that we all ask or are asked, and then some just silly stuff for fun because, let's just keep it fresh, right?
Hey, if it's just a question of keeping the vibe casual, I can easily go and grab a beer.
If you want.
We could just do
cool.
this. I mean, one of the things I seriously miss about the before times is just being able to hang out with people across a table and drink a beer while we have exactly this kind of conversation.
I know, and I've often thought that it would be really fun to do like a fireside author chat where we just shoot the bull and drink whatever we're drinking, coffee, beer, wine, what have you. Romulan ale is welcome too, whatever comes along. And so I thought that would be a fun thing to do. So maybe that's something to kind of open up a possibility to just pick a topic and just freewheel and get silly or not. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and start asking questions, and you can always just interject. And if you want to just jump off on some tangent, you're welcome to do that too.
Sure.
And we'll get started. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start with your bio because I kind of loved it, and I'm going to read it for those who haven't seen it. And I picked this off your site. So Peter Watts is an awkward hybrid biologist, science fiction author, and according to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, convicted felon / Taoist. In addition to a number of accolades for science fiction, he has won minor awards in fields as diverse as marine mammal research and video documentary. None of these have gone to his head since they have never involved a lot of cash. Welcome to science.
Welcome to writing.
Both. So therefore we're doubly cursed, right? Having been enduring both in our lives. So let's take a little bit about the science fiction, and then I'll talk a little bit about the science and then other fun stuff. So when did you know, or at least suspect, that you wanted to write science fiction?
I was, I think, 7 years old, possibly 8. I was living in Calgary at the time, and we were listening to Canada's national radio broadcaster, the CBC, and they were playing the soundtrack from Walt Disney's 1958 adaptation of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And I thought it was pretty cool. I don't know, back in the days, probably before your time, but they would release soundtracks for movies on big clunky Victorian type contraptions called LPs.
I know what LPs are. Not that.
and it would be sort of a distilled bits of dialogue and stuff from the movie with music and some narration and stuff. And I kind of thought this was awesome. So I immediately wrote down as much as I could remember of this 1 hour or 40-minute soundtrack adaptation in sort of purple crayon on foolscap, and brought it to my dad. And he was kind enough not to point out that I had just plagiarized, one of the more famous works of the past century, and pointed out certain things that he thought might not work as well dramatically as they could have.
Helpful.
So basically, my first act of creative writing was one of theft and plagiarism, and I got away with it. So I figured, I could do this.
All right.
That was kind of the start.
That's pretty cool. Having like I grew up in the 70s and 80s. And so my Disney experience started out traumatic, and then it moved to fun stuff. Like I don't know why, but I hated the Jungle Book when it first came out. I was traumatized as a little kid watching it.
Oh,
But then,
Jesus, that movie was terrible. I mean, I'm sorry, but I read one of the things growing up, my parents would read to me Rudyard Kipling's original Mowgli stories, right?
yeah.
So I had in my mind what it was gonna be when I went to see that movie. And it was all a bunch of stupid cartoon animals singing, What happens to the point where Mowgli, the scene where Mowgli actually kills Shere Khan and is gutting him, and the villagers come out and basically stone him for being a demon who communes with wolves, and like all this really cool, very dark stuff that, speaking to the incipient biologist in me, and then Disney comes along, and Disney didn't actually used to do that. Remember?
Oh yeah.
Remember Bambi? Bambi's mom got killed and didn't come back as a stupid talking constellation over the stratosphere. Death was real in Walt Disney's world until the Jungle Book.
Yeah, I agree. And thinking in terms of the fairy tale stories, like Sleeping Beauty is a masterful scene. I don't think anybody's topped that dragon, right? Like that scared me. I was like, that dragon's real. This is not an illustration. This is not, like you felt that there were some stakes there. And in Jungle Book, it was too cutesy. And even I, as a little kid, saw that. So when I saw Star Wars when I was 3, that's the one that blew my mind. And of course, I thought Alderaan was Earth, and I thought, wait a minute, that can't be right. So, but Disney now ironically owning Star Wars, then there's a whole nother discussion there. But
yes, Disney's gone back from being fun to being traumatic again.
Well, I think that's a good thing, but
no, I mean the way they treat their writers.
That's a current topic that's been a major problem. The whole situation of Disney not paying the writers that came in, with the rights to all these different books. And so that's definitely something that is really disturbing. And I don't know what's going to happen with that, but I do like that everybody's sort of teaming up, the writers.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of what has to happen. One thing I've learned is that the writing community supports each other, like most artist communities do. But in this case, you have this behemoth, essential monopoly, trying to not give their writers their due, and it can't be allowed to happen, right? So
yeah, it surprises me that actually, in my experience is perhaps a little more Darwinian than yours, in that I get the sense that at least here in Toronto, the writing so-called community is more like a couple of tribes competing over the same water hole. But there's nothing to bring disparate interests together like a common enemy.
True.
And Disney is definitely that. And it's nice to see that Foster's come to some kind of an arrangement. I don't know what it was. They probably put a gag order on him, but he seems to be getting paid something now.
Right. Yeah. And there's improvement there, which is good news. So it's something to keep an eye on. And it's too, like I think about this and I think, if Disney came to me and wanted me to do something, my first instinct would be to say no. And it has been that way for a while, just because I'm suspicious of things that are too big, and I like having ownership over my IP. And I don't know that I would like what Disney would do with it, so for various and sundry reasons, to say nothing of the author payment aspect. So, and now more than ever, I feel like I just think I would probably say no, no matter how much money was waved in my face. There's things that I do stand for and things that I don't. So, and maybe it comes from being a broke biologist and writer that I need that little bit of time, seeing that low balance. And I don't know, but I could use a little more money than I have, but maybe it's my soul.
It's interesting. I've sort of got the same perspective on that, in the sense that, having spent most of my life living fairly close to the poverty line, you never get to the point where, as Rod Serling described it, Hollywood drives up to your front lawn and puts a dump truck of money on your front stoop, and in very short order you become addicted to the money. You need it to survive, and then they own you. Yeah, having never made a whole lot of money, we at least are spared that addiction. But at the same time, you got to eat, and times are getting more uncertain, I think, not less. Right. So a little bit of financial security would definitely be nice.
Exactly. And, and from an American perspective, which you don't have to worry about, but the whole benefits situation, healthcare and things like that, you're way behind every other developed country. And when you're a writer and you're working freelance and you're doing contracts, if it's science writing, if it's fiction, whatever, you don't have those benefits. If something happens, like I'm a mother, and like I have to think about my younger children, they're in their teens and tweens, and it's scary to think about. So yeah, if the right deal came along and it would help me out in that regard, I would take it. But from Disney, I don't think so. So there we are.
Yeah.
So let's move along, and I want to talk a little bit about the science background that you have and how it informed your science fiction. Now, you're talking about how when you were watching Jungle Book, how as you like the science aspect, having read, the actual text, and then being disappointed in what you saw. So that tells me that from some time ago, you had a scientific bent to you and a curiosity. And so I'd like to know how that influenced or affects your science fiction.
Well, just for the record, I did not so much object to the lack of scientific rigor in the Jungle Book. I mean, a book essentially about talking elephants and tigers is not something that you go to for rigor anyhow. What I appreciated about Kipling's work was the fundamental darkness of it.
Yeah.
That this was a jungle setting and there were rules, and I loved the way the society was set up, that it was all basically stripped away by Disney in favor of a series of musical set pieces.
Right.
In terms of the way the science affects my writing, I pretty much regard my science fiction and my actual scientific career, such as it was, as flip sides of the same coin. I mean, they're both basically predicated on asking what if, or what about that, and following the data where they go. The difference with science fiction is that you don't have to go around filleting various funding agencies.
True.
To try and get some trivial grant to study lacrimal secretions in herring gulls, and you're also able to take on much bigger issues. My doctoral thesis, which I sort of referred to in conference settings and so on as the reincarnation of Max Headroom, involved building biophysical simulation models to simulate reactions between harbor seals and their physical environment, and the ways in which this could be used to predict their behavior. But you can't look at things like the nature of consciousness or global issues when you're doing a PhD or when you're doing any kind of research. It tends to be far more focused. With science fiction, you can take the same curious mindset and apply it to as big an issue as you like, and you'll probably screw up because you're writing a science fiction story and you're generally writing about things that you don't have a degree in and you don't really know anything about. But nobody's really going to care that much because it's, after all, there's a reason they call it science fiction.
Right.
I do still have that low self-esteem that gets hammered into you during the course of your science education. So I have a tendency to tack actual peer-reviewed references on the backs of my my science fiction stories. I've done that. I think Blindsight had 144 different references, a few of which were made up, like the stuff on vampire evolution and biology is pretty obviously made up. But the parts about gamma protocoherin and prionic diseases, vampires being immune to prionic disease and so on, was actually taken from, I mean, not vampire literature, but certainly biological literature.
Right.
And I basically do this because I know that there are people out there who I used to be in science with, who probably regard me as like one step up from a child molester, because I've sort of gone into science fiction. And I guess this is my half-assed way of saying, see, I can still read the literature. Look at me. If you have a problem with it, don't complain to me. Complain to this guy who wrote about it in Nature.
This 2007 article says, I'm not making this up. So
yeah. So, and the side effect of this is that people actually enjoy the references and the postscripts in my annotated essays, in some cases, sadly, more than they enjoy the actual novel. And people go and read it, and that's actually kind of good. It means that I think I'm the only person who's ever written a science fiction novel that's been used as a required core text for neuropsych courses.
Really?
Yeah, and I was Blindsight.
That was Blindsight. Okay.
And I always wanted, my publishers to sort of put that as sort of the blurb, reads like a neuroscience textbook. But for some reason, marketing was just never really on board with that kind of an approach.
Yeah, sales folks don't like that. So, but that does bring me to my next question, which is kind of a segue, because I know as a magician, you're not supposed to reveal your secrets, but what are some of your go-to sources for the scientific aspects of your sci-fi?
I think it's not so much. I mean, I do have the standard RSS feeds. Right. I get the Nature daily bulletin. I follow environmental issues. I used to be a member of AAAS, as you still are, I believe.
Yeah.
I basically let my membership lapse because of some of the copy protection stuff they were putting on their downloadable stuff. I just got sick and tired of their constant attempts at anti-piracy. Cory Doctorow has stuff to say about that.
Yes, he does. I know him. So.
Yeah, so do I. He actually saved my ass when I got arrested at the border.
I could totally see that. That's a fun side story that I was hinting at earlier. So.
No, he basically woke up half the internet on my behalf. I didn't have to pay for my. Yeah, he's a great guy.
He is.
But I think that so I do try and research things, especially when I'm coming up with something that's batshit insane and I want to justify it for those guys who think I'm child molesters. I've actually appeared in Nature twice, writing science fiction stories for those guys. I was hoping that those guys who have been spending their entire lives trying to get into Nature would like howl in outrage, but I haven't heard anything from them. So there's
howling, but silently. That's
true. Never let your enemies see that you're weak. Yeah. Thank you. That makes me feel a lot better. So I've got all that, and I have those sources. Also, another really cool source is that when you've been around for a while, people actually come up to you and say, "Hi, I'm a cognitive neuroscience," or "Hi, I read your stuff. I've got patents on laser technology." So I've got this whole list of people that I can use, that I can sort of run things past them. But I think more fundamental to all of that is not the fact, but the mindset. I think some very bad science fiction has been written by people with profoundly good scientific credentials. I think that being raised as a scientist to some extent tends to hammer the creativity out of you. It teaches you to write in sort of weird obfuscatory terms that are meant to sound impressive with reviewers. You're taught not to speculate. I assume you're familiar with the works of Vernor Vinge?
I have not read those.
Okay, well, just as a quick example, the dude's formal background is in computer science and mathematics. So that's his area of expertise. And he's written a couple of really brilliant books based on zones of thought, the idea that the laws of physics actually change with distance from the center of the galaxy. So there is a point at which, and we're in the deep zone, if there's a point at which when you get past a certain point, the speed of light is no longer a limiting factor. So So you can have these, and sort of out near the edge of the galaxy are these sort of transcendent godlike things, right? Because there's a gradient to the actual laws of physics. Now, this is, as far as we know, complete bullshit. Basically, he built a sandbox, and it was a fun sandbox. And you can play a lot around with those ideas. If those are, in fact, the rules of the game, what are the logical follow-on consequences? That, to me, is science fiction. You start with a premise, not to say this is the way things are, but supposing this is the way things are, what would be rigorously following that premise?
Yeah.
What would be the consequences? Now, in the same books, he had interstellar communication networks, which, if you look at them, they're basically just like 90s era Usenet with the serial numbers filed off. So the area in which he had the greatest formal expertise, he showed the least imagination. I mean, this is a story that takes place thousands of years in the future.
So he didn't project what.
And he can't. Yeah, Robert Forward, who wrote a really interesting, if badly written, book about life evolving on a neutron star.
Oh.
Also a physicist. He shows, in the middle of the 2050s, his computer screens they all speak in all caps in, green letters on a black screen. I mean, we are trained as scientists not to get beyond the paradigm because that's where our bread is buttered. Right. And so I think perhaps the best way to write science fiction is to get qualified in a field of science, but then don't write within that field because you will be encrusted with the dogma of that particular kind of expertise.
Right.
Whereas if you jump sideways into something that you don't really know much about, you may get everything wrong, but you will still have your respect for the scientific process. You'll still be an empiricist, and you will be able to remember that we don't know everything yet. You can't assume that the current state of the art is going to be the future state of the art.
Right. I think that's talk about a sandbox. That's a fun one to play in as a writer with a science background. I don't write particularly about ecology and evolutionary biology, but I hint at it, in the world building. And so it's fun to kind of just wink, wink, nudge, nudge, but I don't get too embroiled in it, because you have to factor in, well, if you come up with one planet that's got this particular species that relies on another species, et cetera, then you've got 30 other planets to think about. You don't want to bog down the story, even though that's pretty cool. And you could have your own travel guide and have a nature guide if you wanted to, but does it serve the story? Because that's what I keep going back to. It's like, how is this serving the story? Like how, even though, I know about ecology and I've got this animal that can do this thing, the animal has to serve the story. I don't really need to, even though I know I've already thought it out, like the whole animal's life cycle and stuff like that. It's not going to really help the reader until maybe they want a little guide much later. Like, just get to the story, tell the story.
Yeah, no, I totally hear you on that. I'm embroiled right now in writing a short story I'm not allowed to talk about, but I've decided I hate it because so much of it is now world building.
Yeah.
And there were reasons for that. I tend to get way too kind of talky and didactic in some of my stuff anyway, but there were reasons why this turned from a really cool story about one person into kind of an essay through dialogue about societal impacts. But that still totally destroys and diffuses the focus on the narrative. And we are presumably, this is what I've read anyhow, we are wired cognitively for narrative.
Yes.
There's anti-predator strategies that allow us to make category errors and seeing things like faces in the clouds, or a picture like Elvis looking at an Elvis statue on Mars or something. These various forms of pareidolia, old ancient predator response mechanisms that get repurposed into narrative and storytelling and religion, and so that really is, even if you have a message that you want to convey, you don't want to say this is the message. I always want to tell a story. And unfortunately, it means that a lot of really cool stuff gets sort of left off stage and people don't always see how much homework you've done. And that's always kind of a drag.
Yeah. I did all that research.
I'm going to take you up on that beer. If you will forgive me for like 15 seconds, I'll be right back.
All right.
You will like this beer.
All right. So we'll come right back. You'll have a beer in hand and I'll have more questions. Welcome back. I feel like this is a missed opportunity that we could have like a
Sorry,
little
couldn't hear that because I'm still putting my earphones back in. Start again.
I can hear you now. It's a missed opportunity as writers. Like, why don't we have a mini fridge under our desks? You know.
What an excellent idea. Let me show you this. This is a highly context-specific beer.
Okay.
But behold.
Oh, groovy. Odyssey.
It is called Odyssey. Now, this is actually from a local microbrewery called Banded Brewery. And if you look closely, you will see that the thing in the space helmet is a raccoon.
I see that. I love it.
And so all of Bandit's beers tend to be raccoon based.
Oh, that's
there tend to be raccoons in the label somewhere. But they have a Dune themed beer. They had a long time ago. They had a beer called Anomaly that showed the monolith from 2001.
Really?
Yeah, they're but anyhow, yes. I mean, if you're going to drink a beer during a talk about science fiction, raccoons in spacesuits, I mean, this is way before Guardians of the Galaxy came out.
I know. Rocket could never. So.
Not that I'm not a big fan of Rocket. Even their glasses. Behold their glasses.
Ooh, that is the cutest. I love it.
Isn't it?
Yeah. Trash Panda Sci-Fi. I mean,
you've done it. You have invented a new, except what we're going to have to call it is like Trash Panda Punk. It doesn't have any legitimacy unless you stick the word punk in the word somewhere.
Okay, punk. All right.
Panda Punk.
Panda Punk. Well, and then there's Red Panda because.
Yeah.
I know for the Twitterati, our favorite Red Panda is @Darth, who is just the funniest and sweetest thing. So let's get along now that there's beer on the scene. Let's see. Okay, so the subgenres of sci-fi are always interesting based on where stories are lumped. So you write hard sci-fi. So for those who read all sci-fi, what is hard sci-fi to you? Because I think it means different things to different people, and I want to see what your perspective is on that.
I think you're right. I think it means so many different things to so many different people that it's kind of an illusion. I don't know if hard sci-fi actually exists. When I was in high school, I regarded Larry Niven as, I mean, putting aside his character development for the time being, I regarded Larry Niven as sort of the ultimate hard SF writer. And Arthur C. Clarke, right, inventor of the communication satellite, also, basically officially named Larry Niven as his official heir to the hard science fiction throne. And when you're in high school, yeah, that works. And then you're sort of as an undergrad, you say, wait a second, this guy is basing his entire known space series on the idea that that genes can code for luck. How does that work exactly? And then he's got, psionics, he's got FTL, all the the usual shortcuts that we use because we pretty much have to. But essentially, the more education you get, the more scientific background you have, the less hard any kind of science fiction becomes.
That's what I think too.
I had my second novel, Maelstrom, involved a non-DNA based life form that existed in hydrothermal vents and basically got back on Earth and started out competing all DNA based life. And I was talking to an old professor of mine, a microbiologist, and he said, "Yeah, but." Because I described to him the mechanism of infection of behemoth getting into the cells and monopolizing intracellular sulfur and so on. He says, yes, but how does behemoth get across the plasma membrane without provoking lysis? And I was like, wow.
Yeah.
I never thought of that. And then I thought, all those guys, one of them's name was Brand Anholt, all those guys who sort of looked down their nose at me for playing Dungeons and Dragons in grad school.
Rude.
I bet you they would think of that. So you're trundling along through Maelstrom, and then all of a sudden there's this like 3-paragraph digression about how a 535 amino acid listeria lysine analog manages to subvert cellular receptor proteins on the plasma membrane, blah, 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 blah. So basically I spent all this time answering a question that my internationally renowned microbiologist professor asked. Probably 99.9% of my potential readership would never even have occurred to wonder about that issue. Managed to stop the plot dead for half a page. And it was still probably just hand wavium. You come right down to it. My Dr. Lynn, Dennis Lynn, he'd probably still blow it out his nose. But it's so hard in terms of hard SF that, I've got I got the references backing it up. It puts people to sleep, which means it has to be hard. And then on the other hand, I wrote a story. I think maybe it was the second story I ever got published, called Nimbus, and it was a complete brain fart. Didn't do any research for that at all. It was like my girlfriend at the time was sitting looking out at this approaching storm front, and she said, "Wow, look at those clouds. They almost look alive." And I went, "Bing."
Nimbus.
And so I basically started writing a story about bioelectric microbes in the clouds that formed kind of a diffuse neural net. And that when the clouds sort of bump into each other, you're actually talking about a 50,000 baud data dump between processing nodes. And it was kind of like a harken back to the old gods, because we're fucking up the climate.
Yeah.
We're changing their environment. And so you've got these incredibly slow, vast, amorphous, diffuse organisms changing the weather to basically out of self-defense and taking out civilization. And like 9 years later, I start reading these articles about these Israeli scientists who are going up into the clouds and finding bioelectric microbes that actually act as particles for seeding and are changing the world. They basically, I don't know if they're changing the world's weather, but they certainly affect the world's weather. This was the premise anyway. And there's something I did no research on at all, and I just happened to hit up. Yeah, I mean, so which one of those stories is harder? The one that had all the big words, or the one that actually proved to be right?
Well, and that's an interesting thing, coming, like, I write sci-fi fantasy. I like to inject a little bit of fantasy, but at the same time with that little, asterisk that says, well, even the fantasy aspect you can make real. And then it's like science fantasy, because that's technology potentially that some advanced species has that we could look at as gods, but to them it's just, like writing on a piece of paper, those kinds of things. But like, I like it when we project into the future what we think. I know I'm asked this a lot, as a science writer and sci-fi writer, and it's been part of my job to do like trend projection for technology, and even in healthcare settings and things like that. Like when we think like beyond what we have and what we know, we can come up with these outrageous potentialities that partially could be based in current science, but the rest of it sort of becomes a bit of fantasy, as you kind of had at the time, but turned out to be real. And I think that's kind of the magic of what we do. It's extremely fun to kind of be like, hey, I thought of that, like 20, 30 years ago, and then it's real, and then you have to be like, oh God, like now I need to really keep pushing further out. I got to be crazier, right?
Oh no, don't do that. Don't become your own worst enemy about that. Then you get wilder and wilder just in an attempt to top yourself from what you did before, and then it all comes crashing down because you just go too far off the deep end.
Well, I think that's where like doing the science writing kind of brings you back down a bit, because
you
still are reined in a little bit. Like I think that's our science background coming out, right? It's like a little tap on the shoulder, like, don't get too carried away. You still have to have some kind of imagined rules at the very least. Not actual rules. So
are you familiar with something called the mundane science fiction movement?
No. What's that?
it's kind of a manifesto in a group of people in a school of thought that says we have to stop writing science fiction about aliens and time travel and interstellar travel, because none of those things are going to happen. And people will read our stories and they'll think, hey, we can fuck up our planet and just move to the one next door. I mean, maybe if you're Elon Musk.
Yeah.
And so as a result, that we have our idea of proper mundane science fiction is stuff that always adheres scrupulously to the rules of science as we know them today. And putting aside for a moment the incredible egotistical self-importance of saying, oh yes, people are going to read our science fiction stories and base their public policies on them. And so we must not be misleading in what our science fiction stories think that, the movers and shakers of the world can do. Putting aside that almost delusional level of self-aggrandizement, I find the whole premise that we must adhere to science as we know it today to be one of the most profoundly anti-scientific sentiments
Exactly.
that I've ever heard, because again, it implies, I'm repeating myself a bit, but it implies we already know everything. It implies there are no breakthroughs, there are no paradigms left to be shattered.
As if everything were crystalline and non-malleable.
I mean, some of the muon stuff coming out of the Hadron Collider right now, they're finding some serious problems with the Standard Model. They say everything we know about physics could be wrong. They're doing the tests. They haven't concluded it for sure yet, but the possibility always remains. I mean, the more than being a scientist, I think you have to be an empiricist. And being an empiricist means recognizing on some level that everything you believe could be wrong.
Yeah.
As long as you see evidence to that effect. Yeah.
It seems to go against everything that we've evolved from, right? Because we're natural believers and storytellers, and we're, but at the same time, when you're trying to work within the realm of knowledge and you want to sound cool and like what you're talking about, but then you find yourself in a little fence, and it might be an electric fence if you're not careful with that. So I like stretching the boundaries, of like even beyond the next step. Like, what's the step beyond the step beyond the step, and just trying to keep. I think the goal is to keep asking questions and keep telling stories, and we can do both.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I try to get in that little Venn diagram of like ask the questions and tell the stories, and I don't think we're going to have all the answers. And then when we think we do, I mean, it's really almost inviting trouble, right? As you said, ego, but at the same time, it's pride goeth before a fall situation of you think you've got it all figured out in science, and then something accidental happens and you're like, oh, and I kept trapped on that experiment, and now suddenly the changed all we thought was figured out here. So, but that's, I think, though, fun, and I like the adventure and the mystery of it. And that I like that about science too. I like that we don't know everything, and it's,
I got to say, I'm a little disappointed that we're not actually disagreeing about much here.
well, we should get in a nice big fight, but maybe it's because I don't have the beer.
Hey, whose fault is that?
I know.
I came prepared.
I have my own drugs, chocolate, which I keep in a drawer right next to me.
Yep, that works.
So, right,
Dopamine production right there.
My little happy pill here.
Okay.
Okay.
So now you are going to have a dopamine surge.
Yep.
I, on the other hand, am drinking a depressant. At the very least, it's going to put us in a divergent mood. So possibly we'll get into a knockdown drag out.
Okay, awesome. All right, let's keep going then. All right. So maybe kind of along that line, what's your typical writing day like? Like do you stagger in, do you walk in, do you sit in orderly fashion? Do you fasten your seatbelts? Do you warn off people? Do you put blaring signs on the door so you do not disturb? What's your typical writing day that's a productive day? Okay.
Okay.
Define that.
You see, here's the thing. I used to have writing days when I was under deadline. The only novel I ever handed in that was as good as I knew how to make it was my very first one, and that was because I was totally writing it on spec, right? There weren't any deadlines for it.
Okay.
Every novel subsequent to that, I've handed in not because I thought it was as good as I knew how to make it, but because it was due.
Yeah.
So I have decided, so there are basically two typical writing days. One is, hi, we want you to write a tie-in novel for this video game and you have 3.5 weeks. Or, hi, you've got, you're contracted to write a novel by the end of this year. And then there's what I'm doing now, which is, okay, I'm finally financially secure enough that I don't actually need a contract. So this next book I'm going to write, it's going to be ready when I send it off. It's not going to be due. It's going to be ready.
All right. I like that.
And there's significantly less pressure with something like that.
Yeah.
So what I end up doing these days, and maybe there's a pandemic element here involved as well. I get up, I kind of dick around, I ego surf for a while, I answer some emails. I'm really, really proud because I'm down to like 207 unanswered emails in my inbox now. And by then it's noon. Like, you wouldn't believe how much. Plus things are always like, I'm talking to you on this crappy little Lenovo that runs Windows because my Linux box bricked out. The GPU's shorting out the.
Oh, that's right.
So it's like, it's just there's that. Plus I'm transferring my bank accounts from one institution to another. So like everything's. So I have a million tiny deadlines swarming around me like hornets, only about half of them which have anything to do with writing. So I'm being reasonably productive these days, but not as a writer. I'm writing I'm writing a story that's a tie-in that's basically based on a video for like a music video from this indie artist that cool. is a friend of mine. I'm doing some stuff that might have to do with those non-fungible tokens. I still haven't decided whether I want to get involved with something like that. That's given the environmental issues of Bitcoin mining. But this is with the guy who did this really, really wonderful. He headed up this really, really wonderful 5-minute short based on Blindsight that's like won a bunch of awards on the festival circuit. Cool. And I'm doing, basically a bunch of little things like that. And I really want to write at least 2 novels. And I haven't gotten around. I've written like a chapter and a half on one. Mm-hmm. And that one I started basically in 2010, and it was going to be set 10 years in the future. Uh-oh. So now I've got some serious issues in terms of retconning all this stuff. The other one is going to be the final one, in my Blindsight, Echopraxia, Omniscience trilogy, which everybody seems to want, except my former agent who before he quit on me, basically said that I should be doing all sunflower stuff all the time because that was the stuff that was really selling. So I'm diffuse. I spend an hour or two doing one thing and then I swap out to another. I'm also trying to get back into, reading. The whole Blindsight sequence was about the functional utility of consciousness. I'm reading this book now, which is by a neuroscientist. That's actually making me rethink a lot of what I've been sort of preaching for the past 10 years.
That's actually isn't that cool though when it happens? Like,
oh yeah, no, it's taking one of the things that I've always sort of spat upon in publicly is the whole idea of the AI uprising. The idea that Skynet wakes up and fights back in self-defense, right? This is a hokey old cliche that has been done to death, and it doesn't make much sense because just because something is self-aware doesn't mean it gives a rat's ass whether it lives or dies. Those are brainstem instincts, survival, persistence, reproduction. These are things that were sort of built into the reticular formation and the amygdala and all that stuff over millions of years. And so there's no way that an AI, even if it becomes self-aware, is going to have a survival instinct unless we give it one. And how stupid are we? Well, and, given recent political events, pretty stupid. But this book is actually starting to make me question that. This book makes me think that maybe I've had my head up my ass with that entire argument, because the guy is making a fairly convincing argument that consciousness itself is simply a delivery platform for feelings, and feelings derive from feelings are essentially a subjective distillation of survival instincts.
Right.
So it's quite possible that you'd have something that's super intelligent, but if this book is right, and I'm only halfway through it, and I'm still skeptical he's going to pull it off, but if he's right, the whole existence of consciousness is an epiphenomenon of survival imperatives. So if you are conscious, by definition, you want to survive.
Right. I mean,
so I could be wrong about that. And it opens up incredibly new and refreshing vistas for me to write stories about, because let's face it, I've pretty much done the old ones to death. I kind of need a new field to plow.
Oh, that sounds like a fun one. And that's sort of an Occam's razor thing. Like, maybe it is really the simplest thing if you boil consciousness down. Like, of course it means, how am I going to survive? So, okay, well, you've got your beer, my chocolate, but what's your go-to snack or beverage while you're writing? Do you have a beer while you're writing? Do you have a snack? What's your
No, not so much. I used to listen to music a lot when I wrote, and then I realized that either the music, the lyrics were distracting me to the point where I was paying attention and not paying attention to the writing. Pardon me. Or I would get into the zone, and the entire album would go through, and I would have not listened to a word of it or to a note. Right. So I don't really do a lot of music. Ever since the pandemic hit, my wife has also been working at home. And she works, we share an office. And
that's a challenge.
She always tends to, well, it's a lot of fun until she breaks out the salt and vinegar potato chips.
Uh-oh.
And then it's like, then you're kind of morally obligated to finish them all because you got all this gunk on your fingers, right? You can't mess up your keyboard.
Right.
So then you just got to finish the potato chips. So I suppose that's my current snack of choice at this point. But really, it's her fault. It's not, I would just as happily starve until dinner until I'd finished my stuff. I don't generally eat much when I'm writing. I don't have I drink myself to utter insensate oblivion when I've finished writing.
Done.
Yeah, but that's kind of a reward, not an in-process sustenance.
Well, like the chip thing is cracking me up because I'm like, this must be a pandemic writer thing, because like I really was never into chips, and like now, like in the past year, I'll find myself going and being like, okay, there's the salt and vinegar one, there's the honey Dijon. Ooh, I want to try this jalapeno one. And then I look in my cabinet downstairs and I have like 7 kinds of chips. What is going on?
Yeah, it's like you're on the bridge of the Enterprise, except all the stations around are not actual communications or engineering. They're just different bowls of snacks and chips. And you just sit there like Captain Kirk, helping yourself to snacks, turning into what eventually William Shatner became.
Or maybe it's just logical. Maybe let's just veer into Spock territory and be like, look, it's a coping mechanism. Of course we're going to have chips.
Yeah.
And what's funny is like, so there's always food in my stories. And so I think it's maybe just this weird bleed through of like life and art. And, I'm always maybe making myself hungry through my own writing, which is crazy. But, this is what I get for looking at Instagram at like 10 at night when people are making like stir fries.
This is what I have to ask you about this too. The whole social media as a saboteur of the creative process. And I was sort of poking around a couple of your feeds, and you do seem to have a fair fondness for posting pictures of food now and then. I gotta say, I don't quite get that. But does the fact that we are online, I mean, you're significantly younger than me, but you're still a child. You're a child of the internet, right?
Well, I'm 47. So I was one of the first 3 kids in my school in rural Tennessee to ever be taken aside and put on a computer. This was probably back in like 1983, and so on like a Commodore or whatever the heck they had at the time.
Commodore 64. I wrote my master's. I solved my master's thesis on a Commodore 64. And
Oh,
the answer to my master's came to me in a dream. I'd been spinning my wheels for like weeks. The data wasn't doing anything. I woke up with this dream in which I explicitly dreamed the solution, but the mainframe at the university didn't open until 8. So I sat down with my stupid little Commodore and a stats book, and I wrote a linear regression program.
Jesus.
And by like 6 or 7 in the morning, I had come up with my results. And then all I needed the mainframe for was to confirm them. But yeah, no, I have a fondness for those guys, that
Yeah, I
vintage
mean,
of,
it was cool, right? It was cool.
yeah.
As for the food thing, like I don't really know, like I just like I don't understand. I think it's a human thing where people are like, "Oh, there's food, yay!" And they don't even care who's posting it. Everybody's suddenly hungry or wants to eat. And so I asked the other day, I said, "Okay, well, what do you guys know me for? Other than my terrible puns, of which there are many, and they're increasingly awful the older I get. And then everybody's like, "Oh, the baking, the food," and I'm like, "Okay." So I guess that's just my brand, and it just infiltrates itself in every aspect of my life: social media, science fiction, poetry, whatever. There's always some food. I guess that's just like my instinct, because I used to throw in the before times. I used to throw little soirees and have people over and have like a big spread because I wanted to feed people. I don't know why. So, and I guess this is my way of saying I can't have my little parties, but here's a picture of some food. I swear to God, it tastes good. Promise you. And then, but
You're
people,
feeding a starving dog a rubber bone.
I mean, but I do give recipes sometimes. Like people ask, "Oh, I need the recipe." And I'm like, "I'll DM you," or like, "I actually have a recipe for blueberry muffins on my blog." Why not? It seems to be popular and it's a perfect recipe. So hey, but
I kind of envy you in that regard. I mean, my science fiction tends to start from an idea. And as a result, they say you're supposed to like feed all of the senses every couple of pages or something. That's one of
yeah,
the
theoretically,
rules that they tell you. And like I get the sense that you're going to be way better at that than
I
me,
don't know.
because I mean I haven't read your novels,
I'll punt that to the
but your use of your invocation of food, all of it. I mean, it just seems to me that you have this kind of a sensual mindset that's going to be reflected in everything you do. And as a result, your worlds are going to seem more viscerally lived
lived in.
perhaps than mine, whereas mine are kind of like these more cold-blooded Kubrickian simulations. Yours are going to have like dew worms and falling leaves and
Yes.
smells and
Yeah.
more power to that. I wish I could do that
It
better
seems,
than I have.
like, and there is even a scene in my fourth book that's coming out in a month exactly, Luminiferous, in which there are falling leaves, and it's sort of a poetic scene, that harkens back to another scene in Accretion, the third book, that you don't know what's coming. It's going to be so devastating between these characters. But there's just a scene with this falling leaves, and things like that, and glints of sunlight in people's eyes, but the idea of food in the science fiction is, there is a coldness to sci-fi, I think, historically. And I guess, if we were flung out at the heliopause, or if we were suddenly flung across the galaxy into another system, what do when we boil it down, we need to be comforted by something at the end of the day. And I felt like food was always sort of going to be that comforter. Like, here's a piece of pie, just it's going to be all right. And so I guess I sort of have woven that in as like it, because when you think about it, like our sense of smell and its relation to memory is an extremely powerful bond, a neural instantaneous situation. You smell something, you're taken back 30 years.
Yeah.
And I think food plays into that a lot, or you definitely are moved somewhere, by, and you're transported. And that was a really good scene in Ratatouille, actually, which is a really fun movie.
I remember that. Yeah.
So the whole, the actual seminal dish, where the critic who eviscerates everyone takes that bite and he's like, bam, he's a kid again, and so that's kind of, I didn't really intend for that in my stories, but that is sort of, you take a bite of something and you have this memory damage, and suddenly something's triggered in you and you're like, wait a minute, this is connected to something that matters. So that's kind of where the food comes in. And I think my instinct is always to make sure that people have something to eat. And I remember one of the readers of Luminiferous said there's a scene in this book that is absolutely a Norman Rockwell scene. And I said, which one? And he was like, they're all at a table and there's food and people are just having lunch. It's just a moment of peace before things go straight to hell, you know. And like just their little interactions and everything's in the food and the drink, and they're just having a moment of rest and normal life, and then all out the window. So, you know, it makes it harder, right? Because then you've given up that comfort zone. You're like, you only have the memory.
Yeah. Although I mean, as you know, but again, as the typical cucumber up the ass hard SF writer, my immediate mindset goes to, okay, so you're in this spaceship at the heliopause and you're eating pies, and then the toilet recycling system goes out, and now you're stuck in a closed system and you're shitting out pies, and and the CO2 scrubbers are like now I'm thinking, okay, yeah, maybe it's just better to live on an IV drip the whole time, right? Because on the one hand, you've got what the human spirit needs to keep itself happy.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you've got what the human mechanism needs to keep itself surviving in a hostile and alien environment. And pie feeds the soul, but it stinks up the cockpit.
Yeah. But then again, everything stinks up the cockpit eventually.
Yeah, but I mean, to sort of paraphrase Deckard from Blade Runner, you know, their replicants are either a tool or a hazard. If they're a tool, they're not my problem.
Right.
So my job is, and maybe maybe my stuff suffers as a result. You allow people to revel in the things that go right, even if things go wrong in the next chapter. My job is to say, well, well, eating pie isn't very interesting, but if something goes wrong with a sewage recycling system, pie becomes an existential threat.
I think this would make a great story. You need to dive into that one.
Death pie.
Yeah. Death pie. So, you know, you brought up Blade Runner, and I have a question because, of course, we're nerds here. So what's the one thing that would tip people off to your being human or not? Let's say like a reverse Voight-Kampff, like, oh, you're definitely human or not. And beyond pie poop and beer, what's the dead giveaway?
Of me not being human?
Or human. Like what would tip people off to you not being human? What's your weirdest?
I mean, compound eyes, chelipeds, gills. There's a whole bunch of things, but you're basically talking about pea zombies, right? You're talking about replicants and things that look just like us.
It could be anything. Like you.
The Thing. You're a fan of John Carpenter's The Thing. That's what we're talking about.
Favorite, like one of my top 3 movies of all time, no matter.
Okay, I don't know if you know this, but I wrote a story called The Things that was inspired both by a scientific paper I wrote on basically saying, why doesn't cancer take over everything? Because why don't Darwinian processes work at the level of the cell? And also, it was a piece of fanfic based on The Thing. And it's the story of John Carpenter's The Thing, told from the point of view of the shapeshifter.
So this is actually why I'm interviewing you, is because
of
that story.
Oh, did you read it?
I haven't read it yet. That's what killed me. It was like, I still need to read it, but I was like,
it won a bunch of awards and everything.
So
and apparently the guys who made The Thing know about it. I got an email from Simon Pegg who said that he's basically been showing it to all the production guys. Of course, Lancaster is dead, but yeah, no, it got nominated for Hugo and got shot down, of course, but it won a Shirley Jackson. It won a bunch of other things.
Yeah, so
and it's fanfic. It's just unrepentant fanfic. It turned into a story about the missionary impulse and colonialism too, but that was kind of unintentional. It just suddenly, that's what it ended up as. But yeah, no, I love that movie.
Yeah,
one of my 2 favorite movies of all time.
Never gets old, and it's the only movie that ever scared me. Like really, I mean because it unsettled me, because it seemed logical, because it seemed like this is exactly how this would go down, you know, and if there was a situation like this, and it just seemed a little too plausible. Another one, of course, the classic 1950s, The Blob. bothered me on some level too, because I thought, no, I could totally see something like that out there. And
Giant slime mold. We got stuff like
we
that in the
have
world today.
those. Yeah,
Yeah.
we have those. And there was an X-Files episode related to that too. And I think it was even set in Appalachia. But yeah, so I love it when you flip the script on the thing from, because wasn't what I had read about it was that, and I don't want to spoil the story, but just the level of disgust that the thing had for humans, and our attachments, for lack of a better word. That was kind of one thing I wanted
Yeah.
to dig into.
Okay. Am I riffing, or do you have specific
Just go.
shovelfuls
Let's
of?
do it.
Well, yeah, no, it's. I mean, again, it's when you actually look at the thing in the Carpenter movie. I mean, one of the things I appreciated about that movie, and I believe the movie is almost unique in the sense that it is an ongoing chess game
Mhm.
between these two antagonists. And the movie begins with a chess game
Mhm.
in which apparently the computer cheats.
Yeah.
And the original screenplay also ended with MacReady in the snow teaching Childs how to play chess. But that didn't make it into the final draft. So you've got chess bracketing it. And in both cases, like, you don't have anybody, being sent off to look for the ship's cat all by themselves so that the aliens
Yeah.
meet them. You don't have, like in the Howard Hawks version of the thing, you don't have a thing which presumably is capable of interstellar travel, but when it actually appears, all it does is roar and smash things, right? You have two highly intelligent antagonists trying to outthink each other.
Right.
So there was that. At the same time, there were some rather weird elements to the movie. Like, for example, they had, a TRS-80 or some sort of a primitive 1982 vintage computer that seemed to come preloaded with software to test whether your friends had been turned into aliens or not.
Convenient.
and that struck me as a little bit ahead of the curve. Apple probably has an app for that now, but
Totally on your phone.
But back then they didn't have the technology, and it wasn't even necessary. You could obviously, you didn't need a little crude computer graphic saying that the world will be assimilated. It was pretty damn obvious.
Right. They just got to go
what
to
the
school.
stakes were. Yeah. But the other element was this paper that I'd read, and then there was a paper that it sort of came out. It was in the peer-reviewed literature. It got soundly dumped on, and a lot of people said, "Now these guys don't understand what they're talking about." The basic argument is that cancer is a sophisticated life form in its own right. That we are essentially we are life 2.0. Life 1.0 was cancer, and that what we know as cancer today is essentially a throwback to this earlier thing where all cells were in it for themselves.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's kind of Lamarckian. I mean, you're basically talking about, if you get an organism that survives at all, a multicellular organism, it survives because the organs are essentially competing tumors. And the reason one doesn't outcompete the other is because it's constantly being kept in check, right? You've got a sort of the taunt between the... And the second thing I thought was, wow, that's a great mechanism for John Carpenter's The Thing to work at.
Yeah.
So I started with that, and
Cool.
And on the basis of that, of course, it's not going to have the same sense of identity that we do.
Right.
The story itself is like, I am being Childs, I am being Copper, I am being, and then the names don't matter. All biomass is interchangeable.
Yeah.
And it refers to everything else as the world. It doesn't talk about MacReady. It doesn't talk about individuals. It talks about the world, because its automatic assumption is that these are just biomass offshoots of a greater whole, as it is. And so its cognition is spread out like a diffuse neural net throughout the body, throughout the corpus, and it can't figure out, because normally when it assimilates things, it encounters another neural net, right?
Yeah.
Because the conceit here is that life everywhere in the universe is Lamarckian, which is of course bullshit, but it's also a pretty wild concept, and that we're this sort of weird anomaly that developed Darwinian along Darwinian lines. So it keeps expecting to encounter, when it assimilates something, it keeps expecting to encounter another intelligence that it can commune with. It thinks of it. Yeah, it thinks of itself as the good guy. Of course, it's just trying to commune. And it can't find anything. It's basically getting into these bodies that are moving around by themselves, but it can't find anything to interface with. And the bodies continue to move all by themselves, and it can't even control them in a lot of cases.
Oh yeah, like my favorite scenes in the movie, the thing, it's like the one guy, I can't remember his name, but like he's sitting there while, you know, the whole head thing is sprouting less, and he goes, "You got to be
fucking kidding." Yeah.
He's the thing.
Yeah, he's Windows.
He's the thing at that point. And I thought that was like the most brilliant scene in the whole movie. What is, you could like write a whole book about that one scene. So.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, you know, if the way you can survive is to cut off a finger, you go for it, right?
Yeah.
So because it's used to thinking of everything as essentially totipotent. I mean, basically what we have is an organism that is built out of stem cells.
Yeah.
And when it finally sees the autopsy, right, it suddenly figures out, holy fuck, it's that thing in the head that's doing all the thinking. It's not distributed throughout the body.
Yeah. Not this
it's
network.
Like it's all balled up in this kind of a cyst-like thing, and it literally feels nauseous because all of a sudden it's like, because it's, of course, now it's thinking of the crew as itself, right? It's like these guys are all me, right? I'm communing with them all, and it's like I shared my flesh with thinking cancer, which is a supremely ironic remark when you actually consider that by our terms, this thing literally is intelligent cancer.
Yeah.
But this is how it regards us, and it just never even occurred to it that intelligence could be compartmentalized like that, because it just seems so pathological.
Crazy, right? Like we think it's crazy, they think we're crazy. So
I mean, the great thing about the thing is it's biologically, it's pretty much impossible. We've seen the rate at which that thing can change, right? You're talking about a rate of metabolism that would basically, we're talking almost nuclear energy, you know, something that can grow teeth inside its body within a matter of minutes. At the very least, things that are changing should be emitting steam. There should be so much waste heat,
some energy release.
Yeah. So, plus, I mean, this is also something else I managed to bring up. Where does it get the energy to make all these changes? And
right. Well,
and basically the argument I made in the story was that nobody was really paying attention to kitchen inventory at the time. So this thing was constantly going down and basically ate through the entire winter's food supply in this course of 24 hours because it just needed to support all these shapeshifts.
See, food is important to sci-fi, but
yeah, but that's the thing. It's a silly, at its heart, it's a silly concept, but it is so fun to play with it, to say, okay, if that was the case, what are the ramifications? How could it possibly work? That's science fiction, not the inherent plausibility of the premise, but how rationally you play out that premise.
Right. Well, and it's what I call the xenomorph problem, right? Because in Alien, you have this little bitty thing popping out of Kane's chest and taking off, and then like, how is he able to grow this giant, like 7 feet
turn from a banana into a linebacker in like 50 minutes?
Right. And then, you know, Jones is just wondering where all this good food is. This thing is apparently found. So, you know, that was one thing I always liked, but to kind of play with in my head, like, there must be all these food stores under these dripping chains in the bowels of this gigantic.
You know, I think, speaking of Alan Dean Foster, who we mentioned a while back, he did the novelization of that.
Right.
And I think, I mean, I haven't read it since like
I haven't read it
since the movie came out.
Yeah.
But I vaguely remember somebody in the novelization complaining that something had gone through the galley.
Oh.
And just snarfed all the food.
See, that would have been nice to have, check off that little box.
Yeah. So many movies. I walk away feeling vaguely unsatisfied by, because there was something that didn't make sense, and all they had to do was check the box. Like a line of dialogue would have solved it.
A throwaway line. Yeah.
Yeah. And it wouldn't have slowed down the plot. It wouldn't have been facting. It wouldn't have been monologuing. It could have been just one offhand remark, and they just never did it.
Yeah. Such is life. Okay,
Yeah.
so
but that's what we're here for. We're here to fix those fuckers.
Yeah, we're gonna fix that. Well, and that's like, there's a lot of things. I don't answer every mystery in my stories, but like I had the intent of doing anthologies later that would kind of find some details. And but I know not everybody can do that, and not everybody's allowed to do that. But they're mine. I can do whatever I want. So, we'll wind this down and start to kind of do some fun things. I had a question for you about. First of all, it's kind of a status question, because you mentioned Blindsight, and I want to know if you could share anything about its current status.
Well, it's a book.
Yeah.
It's been a book since 2006.
But it's optioned, right? Like
it's optioned. Yeah, the screenplay has been done.
Okay.
I'm trying not to get my hopes up too much about it. It's so now the odds of it actually being made into a feature film are 1 in 100 instead of 1 in a million.
You're in development hell, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if we haven't even we haven't even entered the foyer of development hell yet. Okay. The guy's just finished the first draft of the screenplay, which apparently he's not allowed to show to me. He's not allowed to watch Daniel's brilliant multi-award winning short about Blindsight, even though that little movie, it's like it was taken from my brain, because in fact it was. For 4 years we were going back and forth, and I was telling them what it looked like and what they gotten right and what they didn't. And so it's but he's not allowed to look at that for IP reasons. So yeah, that's I mean, Blindsight had a sort of a tumultuous birth. It was my publishers basically wrote it off as dead on arrival before it was even published. One of the two major distributions networks in the US took a pass on pre-ordering it, which meant that basically in half the bookstores, this was back in the day when there were actual bookstores, half the bookstores in North America wouldn't have any copies when it first came out. They had this miserable little print run. They gave it really crappy cover art. It was basically the original cover art basically showed a flying corkscrew in orbit around a giant ball of pubic hair. And basically nobody expected it. Basically people expected it to just sort of lie there. I rather expect that if they weren't contractually obligated to publish it, they wouldn't have. So it just kind of sat there. And then people started reading it, and it started getting really, really good reviews.
No bother.
But nobody could get a copy of it because the print run had been like 25 copies or something. Crap. So there's these genre bookstores out on the West Coast where it's getting like, it's their #1 bestseller 3 weeks in a row, based entirely on back orders. Nobody's actually seen a physical copy of this thing.
Theoretically, they exist.
And Tor was like, I was okay. So we're going to go into a second printing now, right? Well, no, we're going to wait until they sell out. I said, come on, dudes. Your print run was like, I could count your print run on my fingers and toes. It's certainly sold out. These people are ordering on the basis of back orders. Well, yeah, but we haven't shipped them all out of the warehouse yet. We'll wait until that happens. So then that happens, and well, we're going to wait until there's a bit of backlog, a bit of demand built up. And it's like, I don't know what the hell is going on here. But you guys obviously don't want this book to succeed. And I now have two options, right? Like, obviously, my days as a writer are now over. So I have two options. One is a scenario in which nobody reads Blindsight and my career as a writer is over, versus my career as a writer is over and anyone can read Blindsight. So I put it up online for free.
Cool.
Like about 2 months after it was originally published. It was technically breaking the contract, but my editor allowed me to do it, and they've been trying to backpedal it ever since. So anyhow, at that point, it came out. It got, after I gave it away online for free, of course, Corey boosted it. Scalzi boosted it. My editor's wife gave it free, built an ad for it on her website and so on. So all of a sudden, the hardcover sales tripled after I started giving it away. And it's out now in English in about 3 or 4 different editions. Tor re-released a Tor Essentials Modern Classics version, which
of course.
even worse cover art than the first edition. Centipede, a little boutique publisher, did an absolutely beautiful release of Blindsight and Echopraxia. They look like little Bibles. They've got interior illustrations and little cloth bookmarks built into the spine. And it was nominated for like every major genre award in English, and it went exactly 0 of them. It totally skunked out. Cool, but it's won a bunch of awards overseas.
That is great.
It would be great if it wasn't consistent with the idea that my translators are obviously better writers than I am. Because like when you think about it, right? Like in its own native language, when people are reading my words, it gets nominated for everything, but it doesn't win everything. It doesn't win anything. Then people turn it into a different language, and all of a sudden it starts getting these awards. Where's the weakest link here? Obviously, my translators are taking what appears to be a mediocrely written novel and turning it into an award
masterpiece.
Anyhow,
you'll take it, right? You'll take it.
Oh, I'll totally take it. Yeah. So it's being re-released now, and I'm a rock star in Poland and Russia and Ukraine, and like
that's great.
Basically, any place with a history of Soviet occupation seems to love me.
Interesting.
I'm still pretty much persona non grata in your country, but I don't really care about that because I'm not even allowed to enter your country anymore.
True. Which is too bad because I'd like to do a copy in person, but we can,
you can come up here.
Hey, it's been a long time since I've been to Canada, and it's about time I went. Now that I have a passport.
There is a local bar called Stormcrow Manor, which you would love. It is a genre, and basically, it's a sports bar for nerds.
Oh, great!
There's a beholder mounted over the fireplace. There are like alien facehuggers crawling around in the ductwork. They have these old Victorian photos of, sort of the American Gothic thing, except they in very, very slow motion sort of rot before your eyes. They sort of skeletonize. And there's a cyberpunk section. There's a Jules Verne suite. There's a sort of a mashup of the curtain room from Twin Peaks with the bar from the Overlook Hotel in Kubrick's. You would love the place.
It sounds like it.
All the bathrooms are set up as nuclear fallout shelters. The diaper change tray is a sacrificial altar.
Oh my God!
Yeah, it's like
fabulous.
You would love this place.
I think so. That sounds pretty.
If it still exists, I don't know if it's actually survived at this point. We're in our second major lockdown.
We should find out. Yeah. But
yeah.
Well, I'm just going to ask a couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up. So there's always like writing advice questions, but I kind of like to flip the switch and ask, what is the worst writing advice you ever got, in your opinion? Can you think of it?
Don't quit your day job. I was a full-time marine biologist, right?
Yeah. This is relevant. That's why I'm laughing.
I got into to me, there are like 3 different kinds of science. And the kind of science I was involved with in the marine mammal field, I call horse science, which is people are willing to give you money as long as you are willing to reach the conclusion that they want you to reach. You've got the fishing lobby that wants you to reach the conclusion that seals are eating all their fish. You've got the Greenpeace and the environmental lobby who want you to reach the opposite conclusion. And nobody seems to want to pay you to just follow the data.
I know.
So I got frustrated and furious with that because I was working for a consortium that was presumably trying to explore why marine mammal populations on the West Coast had collapsed by 85% in the space of 10 years. And for some reason, the facts that A, plankton-eating marine mammals seemed to be doing just fine, but fish-eating mammals were not. and B, the fish-eating mammals had stopped declining within about 2 years of the U.S. commercial fishing industry moving into the Bering Sea and starting to hoover up all the fish. Somehow none of this was considered relevant to the fact that 90% of our funding was coming from the U.S. commercial fishing industry and the various banks that supported it. So I put up with this as long as I think the breaking point might have been when my boss came up to me in an alley in a sort of a stairwell, and he had some numbers he had sort of scribbled on the back of an envelope, and he was basically saying, yeah, maybe what's really killing off all these marine mammals is sexually transmitted diseases. There's a Kaliki virus here, right? It could be that because we know, because, stellar sea lions, they have very loose morals. And not that you shouldn't look at the overfishing hypothesis, but we should probably look at the sexually transmitted disease thing too. So I quit. And then I was like, I was unemployed, right? And it was not an act of courage on my part, because literally my girlfriend at the time was being awakened by the sound of my teeth grinding at night.
Yeah, you were stressed out.
I was totally stressed out. And being actually unemployed with no job prospects was a better, like, it was the easier path for me to take at that point.
I have been there, and I completely understand that.
So I did that, I quit, and then it was like, okay, I've got 8 months before the unemployment checks run out. I've always wanted to write, I've always wanted to write this novel. I'm going to write Starfish. That's what I did. And Starfish came out in 1999. I was doing some freelance biological consulting, which you can sympathize with, until maybe the middle of the 2000s. But even then, most of my income was coming from writing. And I've been a full-time author, despite the fact that I'm not really doing any writing at the moment, for a couple of decades now. And it's all because of the fact that I had a job and I threw it away. And that's the last thing you're supposed to do. No matter how good a writer you are, the market is so dismal. The compromises you have to make are so great, and the money is so bad that you never give up your day job. And if I had not given up my day job and basically taken that leap, I'd probably still just be publishing the occasional short story now and then.
Right. And that's kind of where I find myself, and I have to make a decision, like I really want to be writing science fiction and other fiction and even some nonfiction, genre stuff full time. And I can't because I have the day job, even though it's an interesting job, it's sooner or later, I'm going to have to make a decision on where I want my career to go here. And I'm kind of drifting towards that rabbit well.
You said you wanted to go to traditional publishing. It's kind of an interesting.
So I would be hybrid at that point, because I would have my indie novels, and then I would be, and I know people who have done it successfully. So that's kind of my goal with, the particular novel I'm writing right now, in between the parenting and the job and the pandemic brain and grief brain and all this, all the mess. And, I think that one has promise, but I also have several other in my IP, that are started that I think would be fun and catchy and, kind of capture attention. So
different universe,
getting it done. So what?
These new books, different universe than the one that you wrote your last four?
Totally different. Yeah. Cool. One of them is more of a hard sci-fi. And there's another that is like a campy comedy horror. Lots of gore, but hilarious kind of stuff. And then another one is there's a children's chapter book, and then there's a middle grade kids dark fantasy, and then I have a whole roster of other things in the pipeline. But those are the main ones that I'd like to get out in the world. So
cool.
And I do want to do, like I was saying before, for the Quest Zone saga, I do want to do anthologies, because it's a huge universe I've been working on for decades. It's full of characters and aliens and worlds, and I do want to do some anthology stories of past, present, future situations with certain characters, and that will be something I just continue to do on the side. But I do want to make money publishing, so moving to traditional is probably what I'm going to have to do. So that's the goal.
Andy Weir would disagree with you, but
well, he's a rare one, right? So that was sort of a lightning in a bottle situation and hard to replicate. But I mean, you never know. Like, it's interesting to me that, first of all, anybody wants to read my stuff, and then they want to help promote it, and when I finish the series, like, I always get a little bit blown away like this. I've been living in my head since 1987, all these characters and places and stories, and it's always such an honor that anybody reads any of it. So you never know who's going to pick it up one day and be like, well, maybe we could do something with this, and that would be cool.
Yeah.
As long as it's not Disney. So
yeah, there's no one else.
I know, right? Because they're so tentacular. Tentacular beasties, they are the thing. So, all right, well, I'm going to wrap it up. And if you have anything that you'd like to say that I haven't asked, now's your chance.
No, I'm grateful for your interest. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much. It was fun.
Yeah, this has been a blast. And
you had chocolate, I had beer. I've learned some stuff.
Winning it Saturday.
yeah, now I've got to go out and weed dandelions for the next hour, but
oh god,
at least
I
you
call them
keep me
the
from
trimmers
writing.
of the yard.
Yeah,
they really are. All right, well, Peter, thank you so much for this. Loved it. And
I loved it too. It was good to meet you.
Let's talk soon.
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere.
All right, same. All right, Ad Astra. Bye.